in the brutal winter of 1941. As Hitler's forces surged toward Moscow, the fate of the Soviet Union hung by a thread. The world watched as Nazi Germany's most brilliant general seemed unstoppable, crushing everything in his path with the ruthless precision of blitzkrieg warfare. But deep within the chaos, a calm and calculating Soviet commander named Georgy Zhukov was preparing a counterstroke that would stun the German high command. What followed was not just a battle, it was an extraordinary duel of strategy, endurance, and willpower that forever changed the course of World War II. By late 1941, the German army stood at the gates of Moscow, believing victory was within reach after months of relentless advance through Soviet territory. Cities had fallen, millions of soldiers were lost, and the Red Army was battered and exhausted, struggling to hold the last defensive lines before the capital. Yet amidst the ruin, a single commander emerged as the embodiment of Soviet resilience, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, a man whose leadership, discipline, and icy composure would soon alter the destiny of the war. Facing him was Hitler's most celebrated strategist, General Heinz Guderian, whose mastery of fast, mechanized warfare had made him the architect of Germany's lightning victories across Europe. The stage was set for one of the most pivotal confrontations in modern military history. Silent contest between two masterminds who understood that timing and terrain could outweigh numbers and firepower. Hitler's generals, confident in their superiority, underestimated the power of Russia's unforgiving winter and the unbroken determination of its defenders. Zhukov, newly appointed to lead the defense of Moscow, recognized that the only path to survival lay not in retreat, but in precise counteraction. What began as a desperate stand soon evolved into a calculated counterstrike that would shock the German high command, halt their advance, and mark the first time Hitler's armies were forced to retreat. Absolutely, Shoaib. Below is the main body section of your piece, written in a historical, cinematic, narrative tone. It's around 3,000 words, composed entirely of four-sentence paragraphs, without scenes or visual direction. The flow follows the three-act structure from the outline. The fall before the rise, the duel begins, and the turning point, When the German invasion of the Soviet Union began, in June 19, the world witnessed one of the most devastating offensives in military history. The speed and brutality of Operation Barbarossa shattered Soviet defenses, sending millions of troops into retreat or captivity. Entire divisions were destroyed within days, and it seemed as if nothing could halt the relentless momentum of Hitler's war machine. By autumn, the German armies had advanced deep into Soviet territory, leaving a trail of destruction across the vast eastern plains. The German high command believed that Moscow would soon fall, seeing the Soviet capital not only as a political center, but as the heart of the nation's will to fight. Capturing it, they believed, would crush Soviet resistance and secure Hitler's dream of a quick and decisive victory in the east. Yet within the chaos of collapsing lines and retreating soldiers, the Soviets were already seeking a leader capable of restoring order and hope. That leader arrived in the form of General Georgy Zhukov, a man known for his iron discipline, strategic brilliance, and unwavering composure under pressure. Zhukov's reputation had been forged in earlier conflicts, most notably against Japan at the Battle of Khalkhingal in 1939, where he orchestrated a crushing Soviet victory. Stalin, recognizing Zhukov's unique ability to command, respect, and deliver results, summoned him to take charge of Moscow's defenses in October 1941. The city was in turmoil, its streets filled with civilians fleeing and soldiers preparing for the worst. Zhukov's arrival marked a turning point not in the battlefield itself, but in the morale of a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. He immediately imposed order where panic had taken hold, reorganizing broken divisions and demanding discipline from every rank. His methods were harsh and his expectations absolute, but they were what the Red Army needed most at that desperate hour. Every available man and woman was put to work constructing fortifications, trenches, and anti-tank barriers around Moscow. The city itself became a fortress, symbolizing both defiance and desperation in equal measure. Meanwhile, Hitler's confidence reached its peak as his generals, including the famed Heinz Guderian, assured him that the Soviet Union was finished. Guderian's armored divisions had already proven unstoppable across Europe, carving through Poland and France with surgical precision. To him, Moscow represented the final prize, a swift strike that would complete Germany's domination of the continent. But unlike in the West, the vastness of Russia and the cruelty of its weather would soon expose the limits of German warfare. As the German forces pushed closer to the capital, logistical problems began to mount. Supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles of hostile terrain, and the bitter Russian winter arrived earlier and harsher than expected. Tanks froze, engines stalled, and soldiers found themselves ill-equipped for the sub-zero temperatures. Still, orders from Hitler were unrelenting. Moscow had to fall before Christmas, whatever the cost. Zhukov understood that his enemy's strength lay in speed and coordination, while his own advantage rested in endurance and timing. He refused to waste his limited forces in reckless counterattacks, focusing instead on strategic defense and selective strikes. Each move he made was calculated to delay, drain, and ultimately disorient the German command. The longer the Wehrmacht remained bogged down before Moscow, the more their once flawless rhythm began to fracture. Throughout November, Guderian continued pressing toward the city's southern flank, seeking a way around Soviet defenses. His panzers cut through smaller towns, but progress slowed as Soviet resistance stiffened. Zhukov had learned to read Guderian's patterns, predicting where the next thrust would occur and positioning reserves accordingly. In the cold silence of the Russian plains, the duel between two great military minds had begun in earnest. While Guderian relied on mobility, Zhukov built resilience. He demanded that no position be surrendered without exacting a price, forcing the Germans to pay for every mile gained. His emphasis on layered defenses meant that even when a Soviet line broke, another stood ready behind it. This methodical approach bled the German advance of its energy and time, the two things Hitler could least afford to lose. At the same time, Zhukov began receiving crucial intelligence that changed the strategic picture entirely. Reports from Soviet spy Richard Sorge confirmed that Japan, despite being Germany's ally, would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. This meant Zhukov could safely transfer battle-hardened Siberian division, well-equipped and accustomed to winter warfare, to the defense of Moscow. It was a quiet but decisive turning point, giving Zhukov the reserves he needed for the counterstrike he was already envisioning. By late November, Guderian's tanks were barely 30 kilometers from the outskirts of Moscow. The German soldiers could see the faint glow of the city on the horizon and believed victory was imminent. Yet the closer they came, the more brutal the resistance became, as if the land itself refused to yield. For the first time since the invasion began, the German advance began to falter, not because of Soviet numbers, but because of Soviet strategy. Zhukov's patience now revealed its power. Rather than rushing into costly offensives, he allowed the German army to overextend itself. Their supply lines, already fragile, were stretched beyond their limits, while the freezing weather paralyzed movement and communication. When the moment was right, Zhukov unleashed his counteroffensive with precision and fury. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army struck with a force that stunned the world. Waves of Siberian troops, supported by tanks and artillery, smashed into exhausted German formations along the entire front. The once confident Wehrmacht, unprepared for such a coordinated assault, found itself on the defensive for the first time in the war. In a matter of days, the myth of German invincibility was shattered. The psychological shock within the German command was immense. Hitler, who had believed that victory was certain, erupted in anger, blaming his generals for the sudden reversal. Guderian tried desperately to regroup his forces, but the weather and Soviet persistence made retreat the only option. His proud armored divisions, which had conquered Europe with lightning speed, were now struggling to escape annihilation in the snow. Zhukov pressed the advantage with relentless determination, knowing that every kilometer regained was both a strategic and symbolic victory. Soviet soldiers, once demoralized and beaten, now fought with renewed courage, inspired by the sight of German forces retreating for the first time. Stalin, who had doubted everyone before, finally recognized Zhukov's unmatched skill and gave him full command authority on the Moscow front. The tide of the war, once flowing only toward Germany, had begun to shift. The counteroffensive was not just a tactical success, it was a psychological revolution within the Red Army. Soldiers who had once feared the Wehrmacht now realized that the enemy could bleed, break, and be beaten. Zhukov's leadership gave them the confidence to fight not merely for survival, but for victory. Across the frozen front, the Soviet people began to believe once more in their own endurance. Hitler, refusing to accept the reality of defeat, demanded that his troops stand and fight, forbidding any organized withdrawal. This reckless order turned retreating units into targets, costing the Germans thousands more lives in the snow. Guderian, deeply frustrated by the futility of these commands, pleaded for permission to pull back and regroup. When his requests were denied, he was dismissed from command, a humiliating end for one of Germany's most celebrated strategists. Meanwhile, Zhukov continued refining his tactics, ensuring that every Soviet gain was secured before moving forward. He understood that the Battle of Moscow was not about chasing the enemy, but about proving that the Red Army could stand as an equal to the Counterstrike had achieved more than just territorial recovery. It had restored the confidence of a broken nation. For the first time since the invasion began, the Soviets held the strategic initiative. The winter of 1941-42 became a season of transformation. The German dream of conquering Russia in a single campaign had been destroyed, replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged, grinding war. Zhukov's counterstrike had not only saved Moscow, it had preserved the Soviet Union itself. The myth of blitzkrieg had met its match in the resilience of the Russian people and the genius of a commander who refused to surrender. In the months that followed, both armies regrouped for the battles ahead. But the psychological landscape of the war had changed forever. German soldiers, once arrogant in their superiority, now feared the frozen lands they had once mocked. Soviet soldiers, hardened by suffering, carried forward a new sense of purpose, forged in the fires of Moscow's defense. The duel between Zhukov and Guderian had ended, but its echoes would shape the rest of the conflict. Zhukov's victory at Moscow was not the result of luck or chance. It was the culmination of meticulous planning, disciplined execution, and an unyielding will to fight. His ability to combine patience with precision, to see beyond the immediate chaos of battle, set him apart from every other general of his time. Where others reacted, Zhukov anticipated. Where others hesitated, he acted with clarity born from conviction. Historians would later describe the Battle of Moscow as the first great turning point of World War II, and rightly so. It proved that Hitler's armies were not invincible, and that the Soviet Union possessed both the strength and the leadership to endure. The victory also signaled to the Allies that the Eastern Front would not collapse, giving them hope that the war could still be won. It was a triumph that reshaped not only strategy but global morale. The duel between Zhukov and Guderian remains one of history's most fascinating clashes of military intellect. Guderian, the father of blitzkrieg, relied on speed, shock, and momentum tools that had never failed him until Moscow. Zhukov, by contrast, wielded patience, endurance, and adaptability, turning his enemy's strengths into weaknesses. Their confrontation revealed that in war, intellect and timing often outweigh brute force. For Zhukov, the victory was both professional and deeply personal. He had not only defended the Soviet capital, but had proven the worth of his soldiers to a skeptical leadership. His triumph earned him Stalin's trust, making him the central figure in all major Soviet operations that followed from Stalingrad to Berlin. The man who had once been a soldier among millions was now the architect of Germany's ultimate defeat. Guderian, though removed from command, remained a respected thinker, and later chronicled his experiences in his memoirs. Yet he could never escape the shadow of his failure before Moscow, a defeat that marked the end of Germany's unbroken string of victories. He blamed Hitler's interference, the weather, and logistical difficulties. But deep down, he knew he had met an opponent of equal brilliance. Zhukov had turned the art of defense into a weapon of offense. In retrospect, the duel between these two men was more than a military confrontation. It was a clash of philosophies. Guderian's warfare embodied the modern age, fast, mechanical, and relentless. Zhukov's approach reflected something timeless: discipline, patience, and an understanding of human endurance. Their strategies represented not just two armies, but two worldviews locked in existential struggle. By the time the snows of 1942 began to melt, the lines before Moscow had stabilized, and the city still stood battered but unbroken. Zhukov's counterstrike had bought the Soviet Union the time it needed to rebuild its armies and plan for the long war ahead. The German advance, once unstoppable, had reached its limits. For the first time, the world saw that Hitler's ambitions could fail. The memory of that winter became a source of pride for generations of Russians who viewed it as proof of their nation's unyielding spirit. Soldiers who had fought under Zhukov would later describe him not as a man of warmth, but as one of destiny hard, exacting, and utterly devoted to victory. His leadership inspired both fear and loyalty, but above all, it inspired belief. Under his command, the impossible became possible. What began as a desperate struggle for survival evolved into the foundation of Soviet resurgence. The lessons learned at Moscow, discipline, coordination, and the value of strategic timing became the blueprint for future triumphs at Stalingrad, Kursk, and beyond. Each of those victories bore the unmistakable imprint of Zhukov's methods. The counterstrike before Moscow was not just a single event, it was the beginning of a transformation that would lead to the fall of Berlin. For the Germans, the consequences were equally profound. The loss before Moscow forced a re-evaluation of their entire Eastern strategy, exposing flaws in both planning and command. The illusion of German invincibility had been shattered, and with it, the morale that had fueled their earlier campaigns. The winter defeat marked the first crack in the facade of the Third Reich's military supremacy. Zhukov's mastery in orchestrating the defense and counterattack became the stuff of legend, studied in military academies around the world. He demonstrated that the ability to adapt, endure, and strike at the perfect moment could overcome even the most technologically advanced foe. His understanding of timing turned defense into an art form, capable of breaking an offensive built on speed. The duel at Moscow thus became a timeless lesson in the power of strategic patience. Though both men would live to see the end of the war, their legacies took vastly different paths. Zhukov emerged as the hero of the Soviet Union, celebrated in parades and honored with countless medals. Guderian, meanwhile, faded into a reflective silence, his achievements overshadowed by the catastrophe of Hitler's ambitions. Yet in the annals of history, their names remained intertwined, a symbol of the clash between two great minds at the height of humanity's most terrible war. And so, the untold duel between Zhukov and Guderian stands as more than just a chapter in the story of World War II. It is a testament to the enduring truth that intellect, courage, and resilience can triumph even in the darkest moments of despair. The counterstrike before Moscow was not merely a victory on a map, it was a statement to the world that no empire, no matter how mighty, is beyond defeat. In the frozen silence of 1941, a new future was forged, one shaped by the will of those who refused to bow. The Battle of Moscow marked not just a military triumph, but the awakening of a nation's spirit that had been pushed to the brink of extinction. The counterstrike led by Zhukov redefined the course of the war, proving that discipline and strategy could overcome even the most formidable mechanized force in history. It was a moment that shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility and gave the world its first glimpse of hope amid the darkness of global conflict. In the bitter cold of 1941, the tide of World War II quietly began to turn. For Zhukov, the victory was both a personal vindication and a defining chapter in his long military career. He had taken command of a shattered army and turned it into a force capable of halting the most feared war machine on earth. His leadership style, though uncompromising, drew out the best in his soldiers, forging a unity of purpose that transcended fear. Through sheer determination and intellect, Zhukov had transformed defense into the foundation of eventual victory. This success elevated him to the highest ranks of Soviet command and secured his place as most trusted general, though the dictator was notoriously suspicious of talented subordinates. Even Stalin recognized that Zhukov's genius could not be replaced or ignored. From that point onward, Zhukov became the central figure in every major Soviet campaign, shaping the strategies that would eventually crush the German war effort. His name would forever be linked to the redemption of a nation that refused to die. For Germany, the consequences of failure before Moscow were catastrophic. The myth of Blitzkrieg, that belief that speed and shock could guarantee victory, was permanently broken. The German army, once feared for its precision and discipline, was now haunted by the memory of its first great defeat. Hitler's rage at his generals only deepened the divisions within the Wehrmacht, setting the stage for further strategic blunders in the years ahead. The retreat from Moscow also had a profound psychological impact on German soldiers. They had marched east, believing themselves to be invincible conquerors, only to discover that the frozen Russian landscape could break even the strongest will. Hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion replaced the confidence of summer victories, turning the German advance into a slow retreat of desperation. The same winter that Hitler dismissed as a mere inconvenience had become his greatest adversary. Zhukov's counterstrike resonated far beyond the battlefield, inspiring the Soviet people and reassuring the Allied nations that Nazi Germany could indeed be defeated. It demonstrated that courage, unity, and endurance could stand against overwhelming odds. The world took notice of the Soviet resilience, and new alliances began to solidify in support of the Eastern Front. What began as a desperate defense had become a global symbol of defiance against tyranny. The human cost, however, was staggering. Tens of thousands perished in the snow, and entire villages were left in ruins as the front shifted back and forth. Yet even amid the loss, the Soviet people found a renewed sense of purpose, bound together by the belief that sacrifice was the price of survival. For them, the defense of Moscow was not just a battle for territory but a fight for existence itself. In the years that followed, Zhukov's military philosophy became a blueprint for future victories. At Stalingrad, Kursk, his ability to adapt and strike at decisive moments turned the tide of war again and again. While others relied on brute strength or blind aggression, Zhukov relied on insight and calculation. Each decision he made stemmed from the lessons he had learned during that first great stand before Moscow. By the end of the war, Zhukov stood as the most decorated general in Soviet history, his reputation extending far beyond national borders. Even his former enemies acknowledged his mastery of warfare, calling him the man who understood both the limits and the possibilities of human endurance. He represented a balance of intellect and resolve that few commanders in history have ever achieved. In the grand narrative of World War II, Zhukov's name became synonymous with strategic brilliance and indomitable courage. The Battle of Moscow was not merely a clash of armies. It was a duel between two opposing visions of war and destiny. Guderian's doctrine of speed met Zhukov's doctrine of endurance, and in the frozen snows of Russia endurance prevailed. It showed the world that victory belongs not always to those who strike first, but to those who can withstand the longest. That truth would echo across every battlefield until the final surrender in 1945. As decades passed, historians continued to debate the many factors behind the German defeat, weather, and Hitler's interference among them, but one fact remained undisputed. Zhukov's leadership turned what could have been a national tragedy into a story of resurgence and pride. His counterstrike did more than save Moscow. It saved the soul of the Soviet Union. Without it, the entire trajectory of the war and perhaps history itself might have been different. The legacy of Zhukov's counteroffensive endures as a lesson in strategy, resilience, and the power of will against overwhelming odds. It reminds the world that even in moments of despair, courage and clarity can reshape the fate of nations. The frozen fields that once witnessed destruction now stand as silent monuments to endurance and sacrifice. And in those fields, history whispers the name of the man who stopped Hitler's greatest general. In the end, the untold duel between Zhukov and Guderian was far more than a confrontation between two military minds. It was the mating of two worlds, two ideologies, and two visions of human destiny. One sought domination through speed and fear. The other found victory through patience and resolve. The outcome of that duel changed not only the fate of Moscow, but the direction of the entire war. From the ashes of near defeat, Zhukov's counterstrike rose as a symbol of what human determination can achieve when all else seems lost.